Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you all. I think every speech more or less starts with a nice word on how great it is to be all together and how much I look forward to the coming discussions. I always mean it, by the way, but I must say sometimes more than others. And believe me, today it is really one of the times when I really mean it. Well, to start with, it's a true pleasure for the Banque de France and for me to welcome once again the Global Interdependence Center and to co-organize this conference. Your mission to promote free trade and economic and political dialogue between countries to more effectively address our common problems and common objectives, and the way you pursue it, combining high-level academics with high-level practitioners, are, I believe, both remarkable. The relationship between the Banque de France and the GIC has been intense in the past, always very fruitful, and continues to grow through such events and through different very, very exciting projects. Well, today is a special day for the GIC, as it is the first meeting of its Society of Fellows, which members are real ambassadors making the case for the GIC mission all around the world and at the highest level. David Kotok is going to certificate, I understand, the first two members in a minute. It is a real pleasure to welcome you today also because we have the chance to be at the very heart of the architectural treasure of the Banque de France, that is the Golden Gallery, for those who have not seen it before. It has a long history, but to make it short, we are here in the Hôtel de Toulouse, acquired in 1713 by the Count of Toulouse, who was the second legitimated son of Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan. This gallery was designed by a famous architect called François Mansart in the middle of the 17th century, and it was done for the Lord de la Vrillière, who was Secretary of State to Louis XIII. This man was a great amateur of painting, so we wish to have a gallery in which he might hang the finest paintings he possessed, and here is the result. For instance, the fresco on the vault ceiling was painted by a famous painter of the 17th century, François Perrier. During the French Revolution, the Hôtel de Toulouse was declared government property and given over to the printing office, and the Golden Gallery really escaped the devastation thanks to the idea of using it for the storage of paper. So the Banque de France acquired it in 1808 and fortunately decided to preserve and to restore it, and there was some work to be done at the time to restore it. Well, the place is full of incredible pieces, but I want to draw your attention on one thing, that is the four statues in the corner. Two of them are hidden there, but the four, you can see two at the bottom of the room, were carved in 1875 by a sculptor called Thomas to replace those who had disappeared during the Revolution. They are carved in oak with gilded draperies, and they symbolize what is most important, the four corners of the world. And our American friends in the room can observe that the statue symbolizing America is on the left-hand side, going out, is dressed like an Indian with bow and quiver, and that is, of course, the way the French saw the Americans at the beginning of the 18th century. Lastly, I really am looking forward to the discussions today. The quality, the diversity of the speakers are quite impressive, and the topic is extremely challenging and appropriate as well. Re-examining central bank's orthodoxy for unorthodox times. I think it could not have been more topical. I'm sure the debates will bring out many, if not definitive answers, at least elements of answers to the numerous questions that central bankers are facing today. Now, I leave the floor to my friend David Kotok, GIC Vice Chair, who I must warmly thank for making this all possible and so pleasant. He will be our Master of Ceremony today, so do enjoy it. Thank you again for being here with us. I wish you all a very fruitful conference. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is the largest attendance of a GIC abroad conference that we've had. We have participants here from more countries than I've added up, several continents, and here we are addressing a topic in these remarkable times. The story of the Global Interdependence Center, I will just very briefly summarize. We tackled issues for 35 years. We were created in 1976 with a declaration of interdependence. The organization has grown. It remains a neutral convener of dialogue. That's the one thing that establishes us, that allows us to invite diverse points of view, trigger discussion and debate, and hopefully learn from it when we're finished. We don't just attack issues of monetary policy and economics and trade, although that's our middle name. We also involve ourselves in healthcare issues and education issues. We've had a series on women's rights in the world, so it's beyond just the economic sphere. Let me housekeep a few things, make some brief recognition, and officially install our two fellows so we can get to the panels and hear what they have to say about the papers that they've written. The agenda of the Global Interdependence Center has become very aggressive. So we are here in Paris. I must apologize for the weather that you all have to suffer with. But Hervé Gonsard, the Chief of Staff to Governor Noyer, reminded me, he said, every time you come here for a conference, we have a rainstorm. Well, in fact, one time we were rescued at Circular because the wind and the rain, there was a storm. And I said, well, I've said a very special prayer for all central bankers of the world to see if the weather can change. Now, I don't know if it was a result of the prayer or not, but enjoy the weather in Paris. It's marvelous, as you know. We will be in Warsaw and Krakow in the end of May, Zurich in September, and Tokyo in the first week of December. And there are somewhere on the table in the back, there are descriptions of the programs and the plans and the dates. And we will also have our Rocky Mountain Summit in Jackson Hole, Wyoming on July 27th. And you are all welcome, although I don't know if the weather will be as nice in Jackson Hole, but rumor has it can be nice there in July. Let me especially thank a good friend, Christian Noyer, the Banque de France, his staff, his colleagues, for the friendship and support of the Global Interdependence Center. Over the years now, we've traveled a few exotic places, we've delved into issues and enhanced a dialogue and I would say become personal friends. What I find is when you have a personal friend who is the governor of a central bank and whose career is well known to everyone in this room, it's very important to him to be very current on the news. It's important to me too, but it's very important to him. So I will, with his permission, I will share a little story, which he told in Philadelphia. sometimes you find yourself in very obscure places. In this particular one, it was a village, I think, in Ireland? Was it? In Ireland. Christian is looking for a newspaper. There's one little village store. He goes into the store, and there's an FT, and he's very excited because he finally can get a newspaper. He picks up the FT, goes to the counter, and sees that it is the edition from the day before. So he says, "How much is the FT?" And the woman behind the counter said the price. And he said, "This is yesterday's newspaper." And she said, "Yes." And he says, with a look as if to suggest maybe I could have today's newspaper. And she understood the look, and she said, "Well, would you like today's newspaper or yesterday's newspaper?" So he said, "I would like to have today's newspaper." And she said, "Then you have to come back tomorrow." Sometimes we don't always have the news. The Banque de France has been a terrific friend of the GIC. We've done interesting things around the world and interesting discussions about issues of all types. It would not be possible to be here and to have a meeting like this without the support and friendship of its governor. Christian, thank you very, very much. I think we should. I have to say that the Global Interdependence Center has a second central bank, which is also a very important partner. I don't see Charles Pozsar, but I presume there he is, yeah. The GIC has had a wonderful friend in Philadelphia, and that's the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. When Ed Bainey was its president, he was on our board and supported us. Tony Santamaro did the same, and since Charles Pozsar came to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia as its president, has continued that tradition. And if anything, Charlie, we've expanded it and enlarged it. He's been a friend of the GIC, a supporter of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, allows us a venue to do some of the important things we do in Philadelphia. So without being in this central bank in Paris, without distinguishing any preference, we will choose equal standing of the Banque de France and the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Thank you, Charles, for your help. I want to specifically recognize two people, Consuelo Mack from PBS, who has come and will be a moderator of a panel. It's always a pleasure to have a media personality participate and bring their journalistic strength and wisdom as well as personality to our event. And Michael McKee of Bloomberg, who may be doing a TV interview outside. I can't see because of the lights. So I don't know if Mike is in the room, but we're very pleased to have both of you join us and be part of this today. And let me also recognize Jill Fornito, if she's in the room. There's Jill. Jill is the directrice of the GIC. So all of us got to the right place at the right time. We ate the right meal. We paid the right amount. Whatever we did, it's because of Jill Fornito. So Jill, thank you very much for all of your effort. And our new executive director, Ben Craig. Ben, where are you? He's in the back. Why are you hiding in the back? We welcome you. This is your first GIC abroad, so we credit you with all the good things that happen for the next 2 days, and all errors are mine this time. Thank you. I have to deal with a ceremony, and it's a ceremony that is a first time in the history of the Global Interdependence Center. As some of you may know, there's a gathering we have in Maine of a group of economists and financial market types. We go to a fishing camp and we spend a weekend solving the world's problems. One of the fishing friends and partners is Paul McCulley. And Paul has been, through the Morgan Le Fay Dreams Foundation, which is his charitable foundation, an ongoing supporter of the Global Interdependence Center for a number of years. Paul came to me and he said, why isn't there a society of fellows, or isn't there a group of fellows where there's some serious academic research at the GIC? And I said, well, the reason is we don't have a foundation or a means to support it. So a few weeks later, I got a follow-up telephone call from Paul. And he said, well, why don't you have the foundation? I said, because we haven't found a benefactor who would help us get it started. He calls me back about another week later. He says, if you had a society of fellows and you wanted to have some papers, do you think I might be able to participate as a fellow? And I said, no. And that's the last words he expected to hear from me. I said, only if you'll chair it. So Paul has kindly given us a grant. We have a funded society of fellows. We have been a year in the work in the design of the program. We're going to hear two very, very instructive and thoughtful papers. They are controversial. I suspect there'll be more discussion all day long about them. The Society of Fellows exists in the Global Interdependence Center because of the initiative of Paul McCulley. So Paul will be inducted as a fellow by me, and my only task is to hand him this certificate. And his colleague, the second fellow of the Global Interdependence Center, is John Sylvia. You will hear from both later. They're not going to make speeches now. They're going to receive these certificates. I think we want to have a photograph. I'm told in my notes we're supposed to have a photograph of this. And I would like to ask if the three global citizens in the room of the GIC, Christian Noyer, Charles Plosser, and Michael Heavner, will come up with me, and we'll all present these two certificates to John Sylvia and Paul McCulley. So Michael, can you join us? And Charles, can you join us? And Christian, can you join us? Thank you very much. We also have visiting scholars. All the bios that you have in your package. Two of the three visiting scholars are here and will participate in the next two panels. Zoltan, where are you? Stand up so everybody will see you now. Zoltan worked on the paper with Paul McCulley. The idea behind the Society of Fellows is to blend a practitioner and a rising star academic, put them together in a viewpoint and articulate it in this wonderful paper, which you'll get to read. Thank you. As a visiting scholar, we welcome you. Olivier Are you here? Yes, in the back. We welcome you too. You worked with John Sylvia on your paper, and we'll hear from you shortly. And Yuri Garaj, help me say it, John. He's not here. Is he here? Yuri. Yes. Yuri Jenko? Okay. Thank you very much. We have the 3 scholars, we have the 2 fellows, and we are on schedule. So my job for the rest of the day is to crack the whip on time, and we can begin. So I'm going to ask the first panel to come and take their seats, and I will ask the moderator of the panel to introduce the panel, and we will commence the first paper with discussions. And Consuelo is meticulous when it comes to details.
Bonjour, merci, David, for the introduction and the ceremony. So congratulations, Paul, and the fellow societies, the societies of the fellows that we are here, and I'm delighted to participate in the Global Interdependence Center's inaugural meeting of the Society of Fellows in this historic and magnificent venue of the Banque de France. So thank you, Monsieur Noyer, for hosting us here. It's really quite overwhelming to be here. And I'm also so thrilled to introduce, to begin this, my good friend Paul McCulley, and the impressive paper that he has co-authored with Zoltan Pozsar. And Zoltan, congratulations to you as well. And Zoltan, as David has explained, is a visiting scholar with GIC Society of Fellows as well. So until a little over a year ago, Paul was a senior partner at PIMCO, a founding member of its investment policy committee, and also author of a widely followed monthly commentary, Global Central Bank Focus, which all of us read who are in the financial press and on Wall Street and followed religiously. And he was also manager of PIMCO's very large short-term trading desk, which overseeing an estimated $400 billion plus in assets. And as Morningstar wrote in its tribute to Paul when Paul retired in late last year, late 2010, and they titled it The Long-Term Legacy of a Short-Term Bond Manager. Unlike many of his peers, McCulley resisted the temptation to chase yield and grow assets and avoided the twin dangers of some subprime mortgages and asset-backed commercial paper, saving his firm from losses and litigation. Unfortunately, many of his peers did not have the same good foresight and strength and moral character to avoid those losses and litigation. Paul was one of the first to identify the powerful and destructive rise of the shadow banking system, a term that he coined and which is now forever in the financial literature and lexicon, so it's going to be taught in business schools all over the world. And also the danger of the complacency that was engendered by the Goldilocks economy. I'm sure you all remember that. We all lived through it, which, as we all know, turned into one of the biggest credit bubbles in history. And Paul termed that turning point the Minsky moment. And 2 phrases again, another phrase that will be taught in textbooks all over the world at business schools. Now, what Paul personifies is the rarest of rare combinations in the financial world. He has brilliance in 3 separate disciplines: analytics, money management, and trading. He has academic rigor. He is a creative thinker. He has a wicked sense of humor, which you will soon find out, a southern turn of phrase — he is, after all, a native Virginian — and a laid-back California dude look. And the dude look was somewhat modified coming to the Banque de France, in that he did say that he would wear shoes and forego his usual sandals. So, Paul, I did not have you go like this, but I will check under the cloth soon. So for the many years that I have known Paul, he has had a forgiving be and let it be attitude, except when it comes to rudeness, incompetence, economics and monetary policy. And the latter is why we are here today, to hear Paul present his provocative and learned paper, Does Central Bank Independence Frustrate the Optimal Fiscal Monetary Policy Mix in a Liquidity Trap? I cannot wait to hear it. Any paper of this magnitude and significance will be thoroughly examined, as it should be, and also critiqued. And we are fortunate to have a discussant with us this morning who is more than up to the challenge. He is Martin Sandbu. He is the economics leader writer at the Financial Times, a respected journalist, analyst, and student of economics, business ethics, and political philosophy, all three, all of which he has written and lectured widely about. His work has been published in several academic journals, and he is the author of a new book just published, which I'm sure we can find on Amazon.com, Just Business: Arguments in Business Ethics. He has been a senior research fellow in business ethics at the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, and also a research fellow at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. We are going to hear Martin's critique of Paul's paper after it is presented, and he will be followed by questions from you, the audience, as well. So there will definitely be time for that, and we expect some great questions. So I would like to have you all please welcome Paul McCulley so that we can hear his presentation of his provocative new paper. Paul?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank everybody for being here. This is my first scholarly endeavor since I retired. And during my 30 years of working as a fiduciary managing lots and lots of other people's money, I didn't have a chance to write 52-page papers. There was a very practical sort of side of my life. However, what I found over my 30 years as a professional money manager is there's no substitute for a grounding in macroeconomics, a framework for interpreting the world in day-to-day basis, but also across business cycles. And I was fortunate to graduate from Columbia in 1981, which was an incredibly fertile period in global economics and also in global theoretical discussions of economics. Paul Volcker had come into the Federal Reserve in 1979, and also Ronald Reagan had come into the White House. And Keynes was declared officially dead. Well, I'm not sure if official is the right word. He was declared practically dead. The Federal Reserve under Mr. Volcker had a 3-year affair with monetarism. And in fact, it was an affair. It wasn't, in the long run, a marriage, but it was a very intense 3-year affair when Mr. Volcker adopted monetarism as a political veil for driving interest rates half the distance to the moon and inducing a modern-day depression, which was the proximate cure for an inflation problem that gotten out of control. So I think in terms of the theoretical foundations at the beginning of my career, and Keynes was in disrepute. And on the monetary side of things, Mr. Friedman, if I guess I could say, Charlie, was in ascendancy, and monetarism, which included both a monetary technique but a philosophical viewpoint, was in ascendancy at the monetary authority. And lo and behold, on the fiscal side of the equation, we had supply-side economics. Keynes quintessentially was about demand-side economics. Keynes was founded coming out of the Great Depression. And so on the fiscal policy side, when I graduated from graduate school, supply-side economics was in ascendancy. And Mr. Laffer came up with his famous curve of the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. As a practical matter, there were only 2 points that Art knew with certainty on his curve, 0 and 100. At 0 tax rates, you will get 0 revenue. And at 100% tax rates, you will probably get 0 revenue. The big issue was, where is the trade-off for a positive impact from cutting tax rates on revenue? So that's where I cut my teeth at the very beginning of my career. Keynes, not buried, because you can never bury Keynes, but certainly taken off the stage, with monetary policy having transitioned from pegging short-term interest rates, a quintessential Keynesian activity, to monetarism, targeting the quantity of money, and the fiscal authority looking at supply-side incentives as opposed to aggregate demand management. That was the beginning of my career. And actually, there's a third theoretical foundation from that beginning that actually I will use as my point of departure for today. I'm not going to talk very long today, I promise, because my points are going to be very simple. Starting with the point that understanding theory matters. It matters. And that was a famous article written by the man who later became known as the father, or one of the fathers, of the rational expectations framework of economic analysis, Tom Sargent. He wrote a famous paper in 1981 called Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic. And when I read it, it first came out. I didn't know who Tom Sargent was. This was 1981. And now it is required reading, I think, in every PhD program in economics, not just PhD program, any program. You have to understand Sargent and Wallace. For you academic sort of wonks, it's kind of like the old Coase article. You had to read Coase 6 times to get out of graduate school. And I hope you have to read Sargent and Wallace 6 times to get out of graduate school as well. And essentially, he laid out a paradigm, along with Mr. Wallace, of understanding the mix between monetary and fiscal policy. And that's what I want to focus on today. And remember, the context in 1981 is that the Fed was dominating fiscal authority. At the time, the analogy frequently was used that Paul Volcker was stepping on the brake and Ronald Reagan was stepping on the gas. There are probably a few people in the room old enough to remember that one in 1981. David. And actually, that was the case. And what Sargent and Wallace laid out was a framework for who was going to ultimately win that contest. If the monetary authority was stepping on the brake and the fiscal authority was stepping on the gas, who was going to win? And the key contribution of that theoretical breakthrough was it depends. It depends on who's going to win. But there ultimately does have to be a winner. Because if the monetary authority is resolutely fighting inflation and resolutely holding the inflation-adjusted real short-term interest rate above the growth rate of the economy. This is a hugely important ratio. if the real interest rate maintained by the monetary authority is greater than the real growth rate of the economy. In perpetuity, it doesn't work. That is called an unsustainable configuration. That in the long run, you cannot have the monetary authority hold the real interest rate above the real growth rate of the economy, or interest burden for the fiscal authority will asymptotically go to 100% of the economy, which is why Mr. Sargent, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics, called it not mathematics, but arithmetic. Simple arithmetic. And basically he said that there was a collision between Mr. Volcker and Mr. Reagan. If Mr. Reagan was going to cut taxes and stimulate the economy, then it meant Mr. Volcker would have to take real rates even higher. And the issue became who would blink? Who would blink? Would Mr. Volcker blink, or would Mr. Reagan blink? For the next 30 years, the fiscal authority routinely blinked under Mr. Volcker, but also under Mr. Greenspan. And we had a 20-year and then 30-year glorious run of inflation coming down, and along the way we had the great moderation, and central bankers looked like gods, and fiscal policy makers would genuflect to gods, and that was wonderful. I'm not saying it in a sarcastic way whatsoever. And by the time we got to the last decade and to this very day, the discussion about what the appropriate fiscal policy should be is always framed in terms of, and what will the monetary authority think? I used to see it all the time in Congress, and you obviously see it here in Euroland as well, is the fiscal authority doesn't believe he has the right to think. She doesn't believe she has the right to think without checking in with the monetary authority first. Who controls who? The monetary authority has been in charge for all of my adult lifetime, assuming my adult lifetime has started, but with that assumption, it has been in place for 30 years. And what I'm suggesting in the paper, and interesting, Larry Summers and Brad DeLong wrote a paper that was released just last week that's also 52 pages, so 52 is the new number, asking the same sort of question, is that monetary policy dominated for 30 years. We won the war against inflation, and the dominant fat tail risk, extreme risk, became deflation. And in recent years, in the United States, we've seen a new attitude from the central bank, particularly Mr. Bernanke. And here in literally recent weeks and recent months, we've seen a new attitude by the central bank in Europe. And what I'm suggesting in the paper and suggesting from this platform is we've entered a new era. Whether it's going to last 30 years or not, I don't know. I plan to be with us for quite some time, David, but I don't think I'm going to be talking about monetary policy 30 years from now. I'm not sure about it. But we're in a new era where we need to quit thinking in terms of central bank independence and the central bank being the king of the policy hill. It's been entire my career. Central banks run the world, fiscal policy authorities take direction. That's been the paradigm. And I suggest we have changed that paradigm fundamentally. Let me speak first to the United States, and then I'll come to Europe in conclusion. In the United States, we're in a liquidity trap, defined as a situation where you have a large output gap or large unemployment gap, and your monetary authority has already eased to zero or the moral equivalent short-term interest rate. So you unambiguously have unused, idle capacity of labor and machines. So you have surplus supply side. So we don't need supply side economics. We have surplus supply side. That's what an output gap is. And you also have the central bank at zero. That's your test for spatial circumstances, an output gap and at zero, which means that the monetary authority is no longer effective by itself. Private sector deleveraging post the Minsky moment renders the demand for credit inelastic to very low interest rates, at which point we need to have a borrower of last resort, not the private sector, and that's called the fiscal authority. That's where we are, in a liquidity trap, an output gap, and zero short-term interest rates. The Fed should play second fiddle to fiscal policy. In fact, that's what's been happening. That's what's been happening. And the most important innovation in that new paradigm of turning Sargent and Wallace on its head of who dominates who is that Mr. Bernanke has introduced the innovation at the Federal Reserve where the Fed forecasts itself. This was huge. It just came in place early this year, which means we no longer have to speculate, and more importantly, the fiscal authority no longer has to speculate what the monetary authority will do if you see a fiscal expansion. The central bank has taken the mystery out of the mystery of telling you what it's going to do going forward. The Fed is committed to keeping short rates, provisionally committed to keeping short rates at zero through 2014, which means that the fiscal authority has got free license to have fun. It's a rare occasion in my lifetime where the monetary authority has ever told the fiscal authority, have fun. And they will never put it that way. We have to be polite. We understand that. But it's hugely important for the United States because the United States faces what is known as the Fiscal Cliff for 2013, which is the notion that we will have a draconian tightening of fiscal policy in 2013. And what I would submit is there's zero reason for it. Most importantly, the central bank's not asking the fiscal authority to do it whatsoever. The only reason we're talking about dramatic tightening of fiscal policy in 2013 is moralistic religious doctrine has nothing to do with macroeconomics at all. The fiscal cliff should not be in our discussion from a macro perspective. The central bank has taken it off the table. Mr. Bernanke and the FOMC is not asking the fiscal authority to drive off the cliff. They're pleading with him not to drive off the cliff and actually are telling the fiscal authority it's okay, interest rates will not go up because we are resolutely committed to accommodating fiscal policy. So it's a paradigm shift. The paper goes through the spatial conditions when central bank independence should be in submission. And in fact, that's where we are right now in the United States. It's relevant for right now because the discussion we're having about the fiscal cliff for 2013 is idiotic. It should not be happening, but it is. And hopefully the paper will bring some degree of clarity why it is idiotic from a macroeconomic perspective. Let me conclude very briefly on Europe. The ECB has got one hell of a difficult job versus the Fed because you don't have a united fiscal authority in Euroland. However, I think that we're seeing more and more of the general recognition of a broader case laid out in our paper, is that when you have the fat tail of deflation, that your monetary authority and your fiscal authority should be a cooperative game. And in Euroland, unfortunately, the game becomes off of one central bank balance sheet because the central bank here has to assume more fiscal responsibilities than it wants to or should, but because it has to. So I conclude with a very simple proposition, which is central bank independence is not always and everywhere a sacred religious doctrine. It depends. Most of the time, it is a glorious thing. But there are times called the liquidity trap and this mess that we have in Euroland where central bank independence is not a virtue, but a vice. This is one of those times. And to their credit, central bankers on both sides of the pond recognize that and should be applauded, not criticized for becoming more political, for becoming more part of the government, because at the end of the day, central banks are indeed part of democratic society. They're not independent of the government. They're independent within the government. And hats off to central bankers for recognizing this is one of those times when saying yes is appropriate, saying no is not always the right answer. Thank you very much.
Well, we promised, Paul, you would be thought-provoking. You are. No question. Martin, would you like to present your discussant's role there, or would you like to come to the podium?
I'll take it from here if
All
that's
right,
okay.
fine. Absolutely.
How long do I have? 10 minutes? Something like that? Yeah.
Yes, whatever.
Well, probably want to hear from people in the audience also. So, well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to the Global Interdependence Center. Merci à la Banque de France pour nous accueillir dans cet endroit merveilleux. You should all read this paper. I think Paul and Zoltan do a fantastically important job in telling us to throw orthodoxy to the winds. Now, to misquote Tolstoy, orthodoxy is always the same thing, but what can be unorthodox in many different ways. And what I'd like to do in my comments is to take the paper, ask some questions about which particular unorthodoxy the authors are advocating, maybe push them a bit on the reasons for that and thinking about alternatives. Are we in a liquidity trap? Well, in one sense, we are, in that central banks everywhere seem to have been unable to re-leverage or break the deleveraging of the economy, of all the rich economies, really. But if we take a slightly narrower definition of a liquidity trap than what the authors do, which is both on the way the authors define liquidity trap, I think, is both on what the central banks are able to do or unable to do, and what borrowers are willing to do. There's a combined definition. Let me just take the first half of that. Central banks can always create liquidity. You can create reserves as much as you like. A liquidity trap, I submit, is when that liquidity is trapped. And it either doesn't go into the economy in the form of broader credit, or that credit doesn't have an effect on aggregate demand. And I wonder if it's a little bit premature to say that there's a liquidity trap in that sense, because that would imply that there's nothing more central banks can do on their own. I mean, I think that is a conclusion of the paper. That's why you conclude that you need this improved coordination between monetary and fiscal authorities. I'm not entirely convinced that there isn't more central banks could do even on their own. And I think that's important because, I'll get to this in a few minutes, what are really the prospects of the fiscal authorities picking up the challenge you're throwing at them. If you listen to the central banks themselves, they certainly don't think that they've run out of ammunition. I mean, take QE in the UK. The Bank of England has published its estimate of how much their amount of QE has done in terms of interest rate equivalents and boost to GDP, and the answer isn't zero, right? So according to the central banks themselves, they haven't got to the point of zero marginal effect of the kinds of monetary policy that they're doing now. Which means, why aren't they doing more? You have to ask, why aren't they doing more? Well, the answer, if you just take the face value of the argument central banks are giving, is that, well, we're doing exactly the right amount. And you see that if you look at our forecasts, we're going to have exactly the right inflation rate a couple of years down the line, and so on. Implicitly, then, central banks seem to be saying doing more wouldn't be ineffective, but it would be too much. Now, you can't have that view and Paul's and Zoltan's view at the same time. Either there's nothing more for central banks to do on their own, as they say, or they're not doing enough, and there are things they could do. This is what you tend to read on the Financial Times opinion pages, for example. So there are two different views here, and people have to make up their minds as to which it is. Or, of course, you could say there is more that they could do, but they shouldn't. But I'll leave that to the side. I'll leave that to central bankers to defend. If we are in a liquidity trap, even in this narrowest sense, that if the central banks tried to do more of what they've done, it wouldn't have an effect. I personally doubt that. I think you could lower interest rates further in the Eurozone, you could do more QE in the UK, and so on. But if we are really in a liquidity trap, and if they did that, nothing would happen, what then? So Paul and Zoltan suggest that you need the central bank to be less independent in the sense that they should coordinate more with fiscal authorities. And the argument is very clear and convincing. The government can always be a borrower of last resort. If nobody else wants to borrow and spend, the government can choose to do so, and the central bank can make it possible for them to do so. At least you have these political complications in the Eurozone where the central bank is international but the fiscal authorities are national. Let's put that's the big problem, but let's put that to one side for a second, because there is a theoretical argument here. So take a fiscal policymaker and a monetary policymaker in the same country. The government can always choose to borrow and spend more. The central bank can always choose to accommodate that. Why don't they just agree and do it? I think it would certainly work, but I want to ask, I'd like to hear from you a bit more about how you envisage it actually being done. Because you frame the problem as being one of central bank independence. I don't think you quite mean it in the sense that the central bank should give up its formal institutional independence and not decide what to do. It seems like what you're suggesting is there should be some sort of compact, and I like your Bernanke quote of two independent nations pursuing a common objective. Nothing unindependent about that. Now then, of course, you have the problem that, when you point this out, the fiscal authorities aren't playing ball. This is different in different economies, but in the US at least, the Fed seems to be doing more or less what you want them to do. They might not be saying it explicitly, but as you say in the paper, they've made an invitation. They've done maybe as much as they can do in terms of saying quite explicitly, I'll let you have your way if you just do it. And yet the fiscal authorities aren't picking it up. And I think you're quite right. This has very little to do with economics and quite a lot to do with morality and ideology and so on. I was a bit surprised that this sort of sounds like a criticism against central banks when it really seems to be a criticism against the Tea Party. But I don't know if there's anyone from the Tea Party here, so I guess you talk to the audience you have. But it is a problem, isn't it? Because what if they just won't do it? I mean, if the Fed has done everything it can and say, borrow already, but fiscal policymakers just refuse, this is just a plain question to you, what then is the upshot of your argument? What do you do? Now, one possible answer to that, because this is what I was asking myself when I was reading your paper, is, well, is there something the central bank could do to, in some sense, force more spending or borrowing from the fiscal side of the government? Or to put it a bit more technically, as you put it in the paper, to consider the monetary and fiscal side of the public sector balance sheet as one thing. Well, of course, you could probably go even further in terms of guaranteeing low interest rates for some time. You make a commitment, but commitments can always change. There's a time inconsistency problem here, the opposite one from the kind of Rogoff time inconsistency problem we're used to thinking about. Here it is, how do you promise to keep interest rates low for long enough? You say so today, but 2 years from now, who knows? I mean, there are ways of getting around that. You could just buy up much, much more long-dated debt, for example, and just allow governments to lock in the rates. It's not clear that they would pick up that opportunity either, even if there was more of that. One very radical thing you could do, and somebody proposed this in an op-ed in the Financial Times just a few weeks ago for the UK and the Bank of England. Well, you can buy up a lot of gilts, and then you just cancel them. Then you say, well, this isn't owed by the government anymore. Central government debt has now, with the wave of the magic wand, been cut from 70 to 40 to 30% of GDP. Your debt numbers look much better. Now you can spend. It's now reasonable and safe and fine to do so. Now, that seemed to be far beyond the ken, even among people who think in unorthodox ways. I'm a little bit puzzled as to why. Maybe the central bankers in the audience can talk about that. Now, one objection to that sort of idea of buying up government debt and just cancelling it is that the liability doesn't go away. Of course, it means that you have a big hole in your central bank balance sheet, and ultimately these monetary liabilities are, in some sense, liabilities. And all you've done is that you've shifted a government liability that's supposed to be covered by fiscal means, future taxes, to one that's supposed to be covered by monetary means, printing money, which means future inflation or seigniorage. So one response you saw in this debate a couple of weeks ago in the FT pages was, well, it's an illusion to think that you could just cancel debt on the central bank balance sheet this way, because on the whole, the overall public sector balance sheet hasn't actually changed. You just shifted things from one part to another. But your point is that fiscal policymakers aren't treating the overall government balance sheet as one balance sheet. So if not, then maybe this is a way you can, if government policymakers, fiscal policymakers only look at the fiscal side of the balance sheet, well, you can change the fiscal side of the balance sheet by doing some extraordinarily radical things in the central bank. I don't think those things are very likely to happen, but theoretically at least, in the spirit of your argument, these are things that could be done. Before finishing, I'd like to consider one more thing. Suppose there is a liquidity trap. One solution is, of course, what you propose, that the fiscal and monetary policymakers coordinate their actions. For the reasons I pointed out, it doesn't seem awfully likely. Are there alternatives? Well, I think there might be alternatives if you nuance your look of the private sector. I mean, the private sector is made up of many subsectors, and not all of them need to deleverage. The financial sector needs to deleverage in pretty much the entire developed world, over time at least. The household sector has to deleverage in quite a few countries. The non-financial corporate sector is in pretty good shape in most countries. So, of course, one way you could think about this is to say, well, you could get government to spend more, or you could get non-financial businesses to spend more. Is there anything that monetary authorities could do to make that happen? This is very much the way part of the debate is framed in the UK, where there's been a worry that smaller businesses in particular, and also in the Eurozone, smaller businesses in particular don't have access to credit, and QE isn't helping them. Now, how would you go about that? Well, you would need to circumvent your liquidity trap in some way. If the way you create central bank reserves today doesn't actually become credit for businesses, non-financial businesses that would be willing to pick it up, you need to find ways to do that. In economies that are highly dependent on banks, such as the Eurozone, the liquidity trap in part consists of the dysfunctional state of the banking system. That is what's actually trapping the liquidity. That leads us to thinking not so much about fiscal policy as about banking policy. And we get to this very thorny problem in the Eurozone of the inability of policymakers to countenance the restructuring, the fundamental restructuring of the banking system. I see that as an alternative to your fiscal route. Or maybe you can just circumvent banks altogether. Again, in the spirit of thinking in unorthodox ways, is there any way of creating liquidity and just get it out to people over the heads, as it were, of government? And I just want to finish on this observation that for all the time that helicopter drops have been part of the jargon of central banking, we haven't actually seen real helicopter drops yet. A real helicopter drop would look like, for example, printing money and just sending a check to every taxpayer or every citizen in a country. For much less than what the Bank of England has spent on QE, you could have sent a £1,000 check to every UK resident. And we might speculate on what that would do to aggregate demand. I think probably more than what QE has done, actually. Now, I'm going sort of far beyond the realm of what is decent to talk about in this august institution, so I'm going to stop there. But to finish where I started, congratulations on your call to abandon orthodoxy. My main objection is that you're not unorthodox enough.
Well, does this work? Does this work? I want Zoltan to have a few minutes, but I've got to have at least 60 seconds. I can take more than that. Don't do that, Consuelo. Thank you very, very much for your very thoughtful and provocative comments in response to the paper. There is zero question that if you take the logic of our paper to the limit, it's exactly where you suggest it should be, in that the logic of the paper would recommend an even more radical conclusion than simply that central bankers and fiscal authorities should have each other's phone numbers and actually talk civilly. So we try to put it in that sort of polite sort of terms, but there's absolutely no question you could go to a further extreme. We haven't had a helicopter drop in a literal sort of sense. And actually, I spend a fair amount of time musing about whether or not it would work or not work. But as a practical matter, I don't think that democracies are quite there yet. But you take the logic. I mean, I look at this thing right here, and it says Federal Reserve note. Note implies liability. It also says this is legal tender for all debts, public and private. This is a really, really cool thing. This is a government liability that's legal tender for all debts, public and private. It has a zero interest rate on it, and it's a perpetual. God, I would love to be able to issue these things. A zero perpetual that is legal tender. The government has the power to issue zero perpetuals that are legal tender. You could issue them, but no one would take them at par, I don't think. Yours wouldn't be at par, David. You're working on that. It would also be illegal. It would also be illegal. So actually, if the government has the ability to issue these constrained only by the price of ink, then the notion that we should be talking about a permanent liquidity trap is an oxymoron. So I will go one step further in this august occasion and saying, if you can print these, we shouldn't be having this discussion. As a practical matter, that's an extreme of an academic viewpoint. As a practical matter, let me answer your question twofold on the United States. What could we see as a practical matter that reflects the enlightenment, if you will, I think, of a rethink of the monetary fiscal mix? And I can point to two things right now. We should not be having this discussion of the fiscal cliff in 2013 in the United States. It is truly reflecting the Tea Party, but it's also reflecting a general lack of appreciation in our economy for the paradox of thrift, that it's a lack of appreciation for the notion that if the private sector is going one direction, that the government sector should go the other direction. It brings me great pain when I see the president get on the on the television, and say that American households are having to tighten up their belt. Therefore, we should need to do the same in the government. It shows a lack of appreciation for the paradox of thrift. One person's spending is another person's income, and income is the fountain from which savings and delevering flow. It's okay for me to stop my spending, but please don't stop yours, because yours drives my income. So the paradox of thrift, which is simply part of the paradox of aggregation, is a problem that's not well understood. But I have two very practical things for the United States. One is, I think that Mr. Bernanke and his colleagues could be a lot more forceful in telling the fiscal authority, take this fiscal cliff off the table, that the central bank is not going to do a 1937, and we would suggest that the fiscal authority not do a 1937 either. 1937 was a colossal anti-Keynesian mistake that created the second leg of the Great Depression. The Fed is committed not to doing a 1937 and should be very bold in saying, leading by example, we're not going to do a 37, we're not going to tighten monetary policy, and we don't think you should tighten fiscal policy for morality, reasons of austerity with lack of an appreciation for the paradox of thrift. So this is a very practical thing. It's a fiscal cliff issue. And there I think the Fed has almost a moral duty to become an evangelist to teach macroeconomics. A second issue, and I think my friend Josh may be speaking on this later, is because of QE, the Federal Reserve has ended up owning a great deal of agency-backed mortgages. And when we nationalized the agencies, we didn't do it properly in a legal sense. So therefore, while the agencies, Fannie and Freddie, should be looked at as simply divisions of the United States Treasury, divisions of the fiscal authority, they're not. However, one of their biggest holders of their debt happens to be the Federal Reserve. And the white paper that the Fed released not too long ago, which was criticized intensely by both the right and the left, was beautiful. And it basically was the monetary authority telling the fiscal authority, go ahead and inflict losses on us. Because as a practical matter, if you put in place regulatory arrangements to lead to very rapid prepayment of the existing stock of agency mortgage securities, the Fed would take a loss because the Fed owns that stuff and bought that paper north of par. They're basically saying, please pay me back par for something that I paid more than par. They're saying, please absorb some of the scenery revenue coming off of my balance sheet. So those are two things in particular that are very practical, that can be done away from the academic sort of, church, is deal with the fiscal cliff issue for 13 and compel by the bully pulpit the fiscal authority to start looking at the agencies as actually part of fiscal policy. And if doing the right thing involves imposing losses on the central bank is standing there saying, please hit me yesterday. All good stuff. So therefore, I'm applauding what the Federal Reserve is doing. So there are practical things that can be done. Zoltan, you're up.
I would just perhaps add one thing with regards to the FT op-ed that you've mentioned that advocated canceling government debt. Effectively, what's actually not being realized in a public debate is when a central bank purchases government debt, right? And central bank, in a way, is a subsidiary of the sovereign, right? So if the sovereign pays the interest to the central bank, that money effectively gets back to the treasury at the end of every quarter as seigniorage revenue. So technically speaking, government debt that's purchased by central banks should not be counted as part of debt to GDP calculations anymore because it's off the table anyway. And as Paul said, that type of debt has just been replaced by zero interest perpetual debt. So it doesn't have to be canceled. So that's how the logic and the techniques of it works. But for that to actually be bought by the public, you would have to stop talking about exit strategies, right? Because one thing that stands in the way of the public realizing that is that, you know, at some point when things recover, there is going to be an exit strategy and all these bonds will be resold. So eventually they will find their way back to that, the GDPs. So in that sense, you know, QE probably could be sold better, right? If it's sold under the pretext of a liquidity trap and that fiscal policy should dominate monetary policy, you know, we shouldn't be talking about it. And then, you know, it's a very easy way of effectively getting deleveraging done quicker.
Just on that, shouldn't you be committing to not exit?
You should commit to not exit.
You should commit to not exit, right? Just let it run off eventually.
Right.
So, yes, so Paul, and we're going to open it up to questions in 1 minute, but I have a question for you. When I look at Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke testify before Congress twice a year, and they always ask him, you know, Mr. Chairman, what do you really think? What should we really do with economic policy? Should we raise taxes? Should we not? Should we cut spending? Should we not? And every time the Federal Reserve Chief, whether it's Greenspan or Bernanke or whomever, refuses to cross that line. And I think you're asking the Federal Reserve, which has a very clear mandate in its independence, and in the U.S., as you all know, has a dual mandate of full employment and price stability, and in Europe is price stability. But for them to get into the fiscal authorities' political fray, I think, unless it's a crisis, and we have seen behind the scenes them get very involved in the crisis, there's been tremendous coordination. But as we return to normalcy, you know, I fear that your argument is not with the Fed, it is with the Tea Party and the fiscal authorities. But I wonder if it would be really setting a dangerous precedent for the Federal Reserve to get more involved in the fiscal authorities' policies, especially publicly. And so that is one of so this new era, I think, to me, sounds like it's very appropriate for a crisis, which we've just come through, the crisis that we've had in Europe. But it concerns me as far as a regular course, because I don't want to see, God help us, the Fed, any more politicized than it sometimes gets.
Your question is spot on with respect to what I worry about. Man, I'm openly advocating a central bank that is more supplicant to the fiscal authority, and that actually is difficult for me to say. It's really hard. And also I have deep appreciation for the notion of particularly what Ben likes to say is you were elected to make these decisions of who to tax and who to subsidize. It's not the central bank's decision. It's the part of democracy. So you guys figure it out. You women figure it out. And so I understand that. I think there's a way to do it, which is rather than taking an explicit view on which taxes or which expenditures is in the context of what can be an appropriate deficit as a share of GDP on a cyclical horizon. And for instance, you think in terms of this fiscal cliff that we've got coming up next year and the automatic sequester and all that sort of stuff, and you can say, this is supposed to reduce the deficit from X to Y as a percent of GDP. I think that's a bad idea, that we really don't want to go from X to Y. I'm not taking a viewpoint on what you're going to sequester or not sequester, or whose ox you're going to gore and whose ox you're going to subsidize. I'm going to take it at a macro level. I don't think this is a really bright idea. So I think they can do that. And I think the white paper that the Fed did, and also recent speeches and interviews that President Bill Dudley from the New York Fed has done, have been very explicit of saying, let's start looking at Fannie and Freddie in a proper sort of way, and that principal reduction needs to be part of the public discussion, and it includes hurting the Fed's balance sheet, and that's okay. So there's got to be a great deal of subtlety in this whole process. But look, no hands, I don't think actually works in a liquidity trap. In some respects, I think it's because the Fed's hands are not entirely clean and how we got to the Minsky moment, and that's an entirely different session. But I think part of the leverage in the private sector that blew up in the Minsky moment and created the liquidity trap was a function of a religious passion for financial deregulation, and the Fed's hands are not entirely clean from the standpoint of that. So yeah, I'm not forecasting, I'm suggesting and also forecasting a fair amount of muddle between the two. And is that a perfect world? No. But it beats the hell out of us repeating 1937, which I worry a great deal about. People forget that the Great Depression was actually 2 recessions. We had a powerful recovery coming out of the first recession. And then we threw it, through misguided policy, monetary and fiscal policy, back into recession in 1937, and ultimately it was only the big one that got us out of it. So actually, just not doing any harm would be a wonderful outcome as we look at 2013, for me anyway. So I have pretty low expectations, I suppose.
So we would love to take questions.
Question for Paul. Sorry. I think there is a contradiction with what you said initially, because we all agree that we're very close to a liquidity trap, both in the US and in Europe in general. However, I don't agree with your idea of the central banks having to be dependent in that particular situation, dependent towards the government or the treasury or the fiscal body. Why? Because I think, and you say it yourself, imagine how difficult it is for a central bank to resist the temptation to increase interest rates at one stage, and you mentioned 1937. Now think in terms of the Bundesbank in Europe and the ECB's difficulties in becoming the lender of last resort. I think it's a great job that Trichet had already started creating the securities market program, and Draghi is continuing on that path. But it's very I think it's as difficult to show one's independence in being accommodative to the extreme. And it's exactly, I think, in any situation, central banks need to be bold to keep their independence.
Let me just say I wish I could agree with you at all times. And in fact, if central banks, and here I'll be slightly critical, if central banks could avoid the liquidity trap through proper management of banking systems, in particular, and credit underwriting standards during the boom phase of the cycle. So if they could temper the boom, then it would be less likely that you would end up in the liquidity trap bust. So actually the first best thing for central banks to do is to avoid the liquidity trap. But if you find yourself in one, then you end up in the circumstances that I'm articulating. I'm not happy that we're in a liquidity trap. As a citizen, as an economist, as a money manager, you don't want to end up in a liquidity trap. It means that mistakes were made by a whole bunch of people. You should never end up there. But if you do end up there, notwithstanding the best laid plans of mice, men, and central bankers and fiscal authorities, if you do end up there, then I think it is a disservice to democracy to throw your hands up and say we should just tolerate it Herbert Hoover style and let the system purge its rottenness out. So if you actually end up in a liquidity trap, then I think you have a duty of fiscal and monetary authorities to get you out of it, because you should have never been in it in the first instance.
John Whittaker from Lancaster University. I've got a question for Mr. Sandhu. He suggested that the European Central Bank could do more by reducing interest rates. Well, I'd just like to question that, because the effective interest rate in the Eurozone is not the main refinancing rate of 1%. It's the rate on the deposit facility of 0.25%, because there's something like 700 billion of euros sloshing about in the Eurozone on deposit at the central bank at 0.25%, and that's the marginal opportunity cost of funds in the money market. It's not the main refinancing rate. The main refinancing rate is the rate at which they've been lending 3 years on these LTROs. Fine, that's a different matter. If you want a rate that's comparable, say, with the Fed or the Bank of England, it's the 0.25%, and I'd say that there's no scope for reducing that in any meaningful way.
Well, just let me make 2 points, one to clarify what I had meant to say before, and one to answer the question. It was basically meant as one instance in the discussion of whether or not we are in a liquidity trap, in the technical sense that creating more liquidity has any effect or not. And I was suggesting that we might not know, because not all central banks have tried everything they could do. It may be that you're right, that reducing the main rate further would have no effect, perhaps. The deposit rate, I mean, I think you're right. That might be determining more of what's going on at the moment. Well, you could still lower it from 0.25 to 0, and there are, of course, views that you could place negative interest rates, small at least, negative interest rates on deposits. That might not be unhelpful, actually, to try to get some of this stuff out of central bank deposits and into alternative investments.
This is an elaboration of a point that Martin made. First of all, for the U.S. to be in a liquidity trap, that implies the U.S. is not growing. And the U.S. has been growing for some while. So, in fact, the political problem is not necessarily that we're in a liquidity trap, but rather that the economy is not growing fast enough to suit the political objectives. But we are growing, and we've grown for several quarters, 8 or 9 as a matter of fact. So that's some evidence that maybe the policy is having some effect. With regards to fiscal policy, I think one thing you need to add to your paper is a discussion of what the multiplier is from fiscal activity. And there's a lot of controversy whether it's greater than 1 or less than 1. If it's less than 1, then there's 2 distinctions that you need to make, and I think this is probably what you're trying to say. One is you don't need necessarily more government spending, but you may not want to have government cuts. And there's 2 different things here. And I think what you're talking about is you don't want the government to contract what it's already doing. It doesn't necessarily have to engage in accelerated expenditures.
You're right, certainly right on both points, Bob, in that the economy is growing, but we have a huge unemployment gap, and prospects for closing that on a sensible, reasonable time frame for the democratic process are not particularly bright. So we are growing, but I think that you can have the liquidity trap parameters in the context of a growing economy. The corporate sector, the non-financial corporate sector, is actually in very, very good shape. It's the household sector that's really on its back heel. So it's not a disaster case, but I want better, if you will, in many respects. And on your second point, you're probably right for me. I'll let others speak for themselves in that I am probably not as religious as, say, Paul Krugman would be about wanting to have another big program of fiscal expansion. Certainly, if it simply transfers, I would not be particularly enthusiastic about it. I like the concept of public investment. If someone wants to propose the modern-day equivalent of the GI Bill, which put my dad through college and put me into the first house that I lived in, if we can have the modern-day equivalent of the GI Bill called public investment, sign me up. But I don't see that on the table. But the big issue for me is not so much addition, is avoid subtraction. And when I see the far right, which has effectively co-opted the discussion, talk about how big a dose of austerity should we take in 2013, is when I get around the bend, is why I need to take anything. I find the debate of whether or not we should have a thimbleful or a pintful of castor oil to be a sterile debate.
Before we close this wonderful debate, let me take the prerogative of a chair to ask the last question. The paper was excellent, thought-provoking, and clearly controversial. The paper discusses a lot of history. Now we have a situation in which the central banks, having reached the point of the zero bound, your liquidity trap, collectively the G4 have about $4 trillion in excess reserves on their collective balance sheets. The new policy is to extract duration from the market and take the duration onto their balance sheet. In the U.S., we're doing that through June 30th. In the U.K., we're doing that. Japan has been and will continue to do that, and we've seen the second LTRO in the ECB. In your historical review in your paper, the periods in which you examine do not include a policy of extracting duration from the market. There is an example in history, World War II, in which for 4 years the Federal Reserve fixed the interest rates at all points on the yield curve to finance the war. And there was a good reason. The debt-GDP ratio went to 110%, and the inflation rate went to double digits. But what the Fed did is freeze duration in the market. So we'll adjourn quickly, but a quick comment about the second paper, which is what we don't know about central banks extracting duration from the market and taking it on their balance sheets, and what we may confront when they do that, if 30 seconds or so, and then we'll go to coffee and we'll debate this intensely.
30 seconds starting. The accord was in 1951.
Yes.
So actually the absolute subordination of the Fed to the fiscal authority lasted until 1951. So it was not just during the war, it was through 1951. That's hugely important because we fought a second war in there, the Korean War, and inflation went up, and ultimately we had a major showdown in Washington, and we had the accord, and the central bank got its independence at that juncture. So I just wanted, as a technical matter, it was to 1951. From the standpoint of pegging the rate or duration removing, they're the same policy. In fact, prior to the accord, the Fed didn't have to buy very much long-term debt to enforce the peg on interest rates, because everyone knew that they were willing to stand there to buy. So actually, if you're going to tell the world what your peg is, you won't have to buy very much. Whereas in the current instance, the Fed hasn't told you what their peg is. They've actually taken duration out of the marketplace. So essentially, they're the same policy implemented either from the price side or the quantity side. but actually they're not nearly as different as perhaps they would seem. And very interesting, when Ben wrote his famous paper back in 2002, he said his personal preference was simply to peg the rate along the curve as opposed to taking duration out of the marketplace. He's changed over time with that, and I haven't talked to him about it, but it makes a lot of sense for the Fed to have some degree of ambiguity, but the outcome is the same.
Martin, you look thoughtful. No. Zoltan, Consuelo. Marvelous start. We're going to break for coffee and assemble the next panel. Thank you very, very much, all four of you, especially the moderator who had to discipline these three cats.